The rocky Aleutian Islands lay in the desolate North Pacific off the Alaskan coast. These outcroppings, jutting out from the Bering Sea, were first inhabited by Aleut natives, then part of the Russian Empire, and finally sold to America. This archipelago was never heavily populated on account of its remoteness, but nevertheless was the site of an almost forgotten campaign during the Second World War. Though overshadowed by Midway and Guadalcanal, the Aleutian Islands saw ferocious fighting in the frozen north, and was the only part of the United States and North America to be occupied by enemy forces during the course of the war. Starting in December of 1941, Japan's initial blitzkrieg across the Pacific had seen the Empire's forces achieve rapid success, occupying areas from Burma, Indonesia and New Guinea to the Central Pacific. An attempt to further isolate Australia, however, was thwarted at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Although both American and Japanese forces took heavy losses, the Japanese advance towards Australia was stopped for the time being. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto was well aware of American industrial and military potential and knew that Japan's best chance for a successful conclusion to the war was to win a decisive battle that would make continuing the conflict an unappealing proposition for the Americans. During the summer of 1942, Operation MI would be launched against Midway Atoll. By drawing enemy forces into combat west of Hawaii, Operation MI was intended to inflict crushing losses on the American fleet and thereby swiftly end the war. Meanwhile, an offensive towards the Aleutians, known as Operation AL, was planned in conjunction with MI, designed to shore up Japan's northern perimeter and prevent Alaska from being used as a staging ground for any attacks against the home islands. In late May, Yamamoto's fleet steamed west, a vast armada centered around 4 aircraft carriers, the Hiryu, Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga, buttressed with battleships, cruisers, submarines, and destroyers. There was, however, a fatal flaw to this operation, as Japanese codes had already been broken. Thus, the Americans were ready for them. From June 4th to June 5th, the ensuing Battle of Midway resulted in a disastrous Japanese defeat. All 4 of Japan's fleet carriers present at the battle were destroyed, for the loss of 1 American carrier. In addition, countless experienced Japanese aviators were killed, a loss the Empire could ill afford. During this time, however, Operation AL had still gone into effect, with sizable Japanese naval forces being dispatched to Alaska. Under the overall command of Boshiro Hosogaya, this was a formidable fleet, including 2 light aircraft carriers, the Junyo and Ryujo, and Kakuji Kakuta's 2nd Mobile Force, along with their cruiser and destroyer escorts. The main target was the port of Dutch Harbor on Unalaska. In addition, there were naval landing forces allotted to capture the islands of Kiska, Adak, and Attu in the western Aleutian archipelago. Meanwhile, in Alaska, the American commanders, Admiral Robert Theobald and General Simon Buckner, were aware the Japanese were planning an offensive in the area, thanks to the same codebreakers who would make victory at Midway possible. This was confirmed when on June 2nd, a PBY flying boat spotted the Japanese fleet south of the Aleutians. American defenses in the area were initially quite weak, consisting of a handful of World War I era destroyers and some small, flimsy patrol ships, which were really just requisitioned fishing boats. In late May, more modern cruisers and destroyers were dispatched to Alaska, but even so, were still considerably weaker than the approaching Japanese armada. Admiral Theobald directed a screening picket line of ships and submarines to form up in order to give him advance warning of any Japanese moves, but they were thinly spread across a wide area, and thus largely ineffectual. Having steamed northeast, Kakuta's fleet took up position off of Unalaska on the night of June 2nd to 3rd, and, in the dense fog, the carriers Junyo and Ryujo launched their aircraft for the first strike against Dutch Harbor. American aircraft at Cold Bay hurriedly scrambled to intercept, but planes at the much closer Umnak were not notified and never got off the ground. Shortly before 6 a.m., the Japanese strike force arrived, but lacking detailed knowledge of American facilities, they were instructed to merely attack targets of opportunity. In the bombing runs, more than 50 Americans were casualties, of which 32 had been killed, and several buildings destroyed, but overall, the base was not seriously harmed. Another Japanese strike force was dispatched to sink American ships near the harbor, but were unable to find them and returned to their carriers. Meanwhile, 4 Japanese float planes were intercepted by American fighters, and 2 were shot down. Reeling from the initial attack, on June 4th, American planes were dispatched to find and sink the Japanese fleet, whose location was still unknown. Although determined, this counterattack was disorganized and piecemeal. A PBY flying boat sighted Kakuji's force and made a torpedo run against the Junyo, but was damaged and forced to retreat. Another flying boat, guiding 6 B-17 bombers, was shot down, and the bombers were unable to find their targets. Fog and poor weather severely impeded the Americans, though a single bomber broke through and unsuccessfully attacked the Ryujo. Small groups of American aircraft made further attempts to bomb and torpedo the Japanese ships, but had no more success. The Japanese fleet remained undamaged. On the afternoon of June 4th, Junyo and Ryujo launched their planes for another strike. Japanese aircraft soared over Dutch Harbor and went in for an attack. The beached civilian barracks ship SS Northwestern was set alight, and a few buildings damaged. More importantly, though, a massive fuel tank was bombed, and 22,000 barrels of oil destroyed. Further Japanese attacks hit a seaplane hangar and 2 American light artillery pieces, but were belatedly intercepted by American P-40 fighters, and 1 Japanese dive bomber was shot down for 2 P-40s lost. The final result of these Japanese attacks was almost 70 American dead or captured, 10 aircraft destroyed, and some facilities damaged or destroyed, for the loss of 11 Japanese aircraft. However, much of the damage inflicted upon Dutch Harbor was superficial and did not seriously impair its use as a base. By this time, word had reached the Japanese northern force of the disaster at Midway, and they were ordered to withdraw. They were first tasked with speeding south and linking up with Yamamoto's main force, but eventually Yamamoto could read the writing on the wall, and the offensive was called off altogether. Hosogaya's main force still went along with their original plan of landing forces on the Aleutian islands of Kiska and Attu. At first, it was planned to capture Adak as well, but it was then decided that this island was too close to a nearby American airbase. Kiska was occupied by only a 10-man weather team and their dog, led by William House. On June 7th, the day after the Japanese landing force went ashore, they hurriedly fled into the hills after being awoken by machine gun fire. But outnumbered by an absurd margin, soon all save one was captured. William House managed to hold out in the interior until half-starved. He surrendered on July 28th to the incredulous Japanese. On the same day, June 7th, Japanese soldiers landed on Attu, which was inhabited by a few dozen Aleuts, an American schoolteacher, Etta Jones, and her husband, Charles Foster Jones. Like Kiska, Attu was captured without a fight. Charles took his own life, but the rest of the inhabitants were then taken into captivity in Japan, many of whom would die by the time the war concluded. The initial Japanese offensive was over. Over the next few days, American aircraft continued to search for the opposing force, only to find the Japanese fleet gone and Kiska and Attu in enemy hands. The campaign now settled into a low-running battle of attrition. American aircraft maintained sporadic raids against occupied Kiska, a series of bombing runs known as the Kiska Blitz. By and large, these attacks did not cause great damage, but unnerved the Japanese defenders and kept them on alert. Due to the inhospitable weather and peripheral nature of the theater, there were no large confrontations initially. Indeed, as the Guadalcanal campaign in the South Pacific was rapidly heating up, the frigid Aleutians were becoming a sideshow. The tide gradually turned, though, as the Americans were able to build a permanent airbase on the island of Attu, which allowed for much more effective raids that soon inflicted sizable losses on the Japanese forces. The Japanese attempted to construct their own air bases on the island of Kiska and Attu, but the interception of transport vessels carrying the necessary supplies prevented this. Thus, the only available Japanese aircraft were performance-limited floatplanes. American naval and air forces were able to intercept and destroy many Japanese convoys inbound for the Aleutians, as a result of the inability to keep the islands resupplied and reinforced. Japan's position on Kiska and Attu became increasingly tenuous, and by January of 1943, these island outposts were being strangled into starvation. In order to restore the situation, the Japanese launched a major supply run, escorted by a powerful fleet, under Boshiro Hosugaya. As the Americans sought to intercept it, the result would be the only large-scale naval battle of the campaign.